The last hope of the 10th sector. The universe had a way of chewing up the weak and spitting them out. In the uncharted expanse of the 10th sector, far from the comfort of galactic law and order, danger was as familiar as the stars themselves. The Elysium, a worn-out freighter-turned-mercenary ship, had carved its name into the dark stretches of the galaxy, often running from or into trouble. But on this particular mission, trouble wasn't something that could be avoided. It was coming in full force. Captain Samuel Rook stood in the heart of the ship's dimly lit command center. The flickering blue holographic map in front of him cast an eerie glow across his rugged face. His hands, calloused from years of service, hovered over the controls, plotting their next move. It had been nearly a decade since he'd been on a mission like this, and the weight of the situation pressed on his chest like a thick, suffocating fog. Just hours ago, the Elysium had received a distress signal from the planet Drozhia, a peaceful world in the 10th sector that had recently come under attack. A race of merciless raiders, the Colgarians, had swept in without warning, decimating everything in their path. It wasn't just a military strike. The Colgarians were infamous for their brutality, enslaving entire populations and slaughtering anyone who dared to resist. The Drozhians had always been a peaceful people, known for their lush jungles, advanced agricultural methods, and a deep sense of harmony with the environment. Now their homes lay in ruin, and their cries for help echoed in the void of space. Rook turned away from the tactical display, running a hand through his dark, graying hair. He had made his name as a soldier, a commander, and a mercenary, but he had never thought of himself as a hero. Heroes were something you read about in history books, not something you found wandering the galactic fringe with a ragtag crew. Yet, as the distress signal's final, haunting message played again in his mind, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this mission might be different. "We're going in," Rook said, his voice low but resolute. Lyra, the ship's chief engineer and the most brilliant mind Rook had ever met, looked up from her workstation. Her long, auburn hair, tied tightly in a ponytail, swayed as she spun around in her chair. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Rook as she made adjustments to the ship's sensors. "Captain, I just finished running a scan on the planet. The Colgarians have already begun deploying their forces. We're not going to have the luxury of a surprise attack." Rook nodded grimly. He had expected this. The Colgarians had been a thorn in the side of the galactic community for years. Their primitive war tactics and unrelenting cruelty made them a perfect threat for mercenaries like Rook. But Drozhia was different. The people of Drozhia weren't fighters. They were farmers, artists, builders, idealistic and peaceful. The thought of them falling under Colgarian rule felt like a personal betrayal to the values Rook had once believed in. "What are we looking at in terms of enemy strength?" Rook asked, his eyes scanning the map again. Lyra's fingers flew across the holographic controls. The Colgarians have already set up a perimeter around the capital city of Lethra. Their landing ships are fortified with heavy artillery, and I'm detecting signals that suggest they have a small fleet in orbit. There's no telling how long they've been here, but I'm sure of one thing: they won't let up until they've broken the planet completely. Rook's jaw tightened. He knew the Colgarians were relentless. They didn't fight to conquer. They fought to annihilate. "Eric," Rook called out. Eric, a towering alien from the war-torn planet Aurochs, stepped forward. His massive frame filled the doorway. His muscular arms crossed over his chest. Despite his intimidating size and the deep scars that marred his green skin, Eric's face was calm. It was a look Rook had come to rely on in the heat of battle. The Aurochs were known for their unparalleled combat prowess, and Eric was no exception. "We're going in for a rescue mission. The people of Drozhia aren't warriors. They need our help," Rook said, his voice firm. Eric's sharp eyes glinted with understanding. He nodded silently, his silent strength radiating through the room. There was no need for further discussion. When Rook gave an order, it was followed without hesitation. Lyra returned to her console. "I'll prep the ship for combat." It won't be long before the Colgarians pick up on our approach. Rook turned to face the rest of the crew. His team. The Elysium wasn't just a ship, it was a family. Forged through years of conflict, each member bringing their own set of unique skills. They had come together for missions of all kinds, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about the money. It was about survival. "Let's make it quick," Rook added. "We hit them hard, then get out before they know what hit them." The crew moved into action, each member taking their place as the Elysium shifted into attack mode. Lyra worked with an intensity that only those who truly understood the intricacies of space engineering could muster. Eric grabbed his gear, blades and plasma rifles, his expression set in a grim determination. Rook stood at the command console, staring out the view screen. As the ship sped toward Droja's atmosphere, the stars seemed to blur into streaks of light. The mission was simple: rescue as many as they could and leave the Colgarians with nothing but the remnants of a failed invasion. But something gnawed at Rook's mind. It was more than just the politics of the war. The message they had intercepted was not just a cry for help. It was a plea for survival. Rook could almost hear the desperation in the voice of the Drojan leader, their hope fading with each passing moment. Before long, the Elysium broke through Droja's upper atmosphere, its engines roaring with power as they descended toward the shattered capital city of Lethra. As Rook looked down at the planet below, he felt the heavy weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The lives of an entire planet rested in his hands. "Here we go," Rook muttered, gripping the controls tighter. And with that, the Elysium plunged deeper into the fray. The calm before the storm. The Elysium descended swiftly through the dense clouds of Droja, cutting through the atmosphere with the roar of its engines. Inside the ship, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. But despite the urgency of the mission, a strange silence had settled in the command room. No one spoke. They all knew what was coming. Captain Samuel Rook stood before the holographic display, his hands folded behind his back. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The Colgarians were ruthless, brutal, and they had already gained a significant foothold on Droja. He could see it now, the small blue planet below, marred by plumes of smoke rising from its cities. A civilization in peril. It reminded Rook of the countless worlds he had seen fall to the fire of war. But something about Droja felt different. There was an innocence here that made the situation all the more tragic. "Lyra," Rook's voice broke the silence. "How much longer until we hit the drop zone?" Lyra's fingers flew across the control panel, her eyes glued to the screen. "We'll be there in approximately 2 minutes, Captain. I've got the coordinates for the city's outskirts locked in. The Colgarians have set up a blockade around the capital. I'll initiate a cloaking sequence the moment we get close." "Good," Rook replied. "Once we're down, we move fast. No detours, no unnecessary risks. Get the civilians to safety, and get out before the Colgarians even know we were here." Lyra nodded, though there was a hint of doubt in her eyes. She was the ship's brain, calculating, methodical, but even she knew that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. "I've mapped the safest route through the city," she said, her voice tight. "But the Colgarians have patrols everywhere. There's a high chance of contact. We can handle it." Eric's voice boomed from the back of the room. His hulking figure appeared in the doorway, his dark green skin glistening under the dim lights. He was already armed. 2 massive plasma rifles slung across his back, a long serrated blade hanging from his belt. Despite his imposing figure, there was a calmness about him that the others relied on in moments like this. "I hope you're right," Lyra muttered, but there was a faint smile tugging at her lips. She knew Eric wasn't one to worry. The Aurochs were born warriors, and Eric was no exception. He was capable of taking on a dozen Colgarians single-handedly, and that was without counting his tactical acumen. Rook turned toward the view screen again, watching as the lights of Droja grew larger. It was clear the city was under siege, the chaos on the ground visible even from space. The once vibrant urban sprawl of Lethra, with its green domes and shimmering towers, was now a battlefield. Black smoke billowed from ruined buildings, and what appeared to be firestorms raged in several districts. "We need to get in and out before the Colgarians can organize any sort of counterattack," Rook said, more to himself than anyone else. "No heroics. We're not here to fight them. We're here to save who we can and leave." But deep down, Rook knew that wasn't going to be easy. The Colgarians weren't just invaders. They were predators. And predators didn't stop hunting just because they were told to. As the ship descended further into Droja's atmosphere, the roar of the engines grew louder, the hum of the ship's advanced cloaking device providing an eerie, almost otherworldly sound. Lyra's fingers flew over the control panel, activating the final sequence. The ship's outer hull shimmered briefly before it became indistinguishable from the surrounding clouds. The cloaking device was in full effect, and for now, the crew was invisible to anyone below. "All systems are green," Lyra reported, her voice sharp with concentration. "Cloak engaged. We're flying blind, but we're undetectable to their radar. For now." "Good," Rook said, his voice tight. "Stay sharp. We're about to enter the lion's den." The Elysium crept closer to the capital, weaving through the dense cloud cover. Below them, the city of Lethra lay in ruins. What was once a symbol of Droja's peaceful existence now appeared to be a war-torn shadow of its former self. Large portions of the city had been leveled by Colgarian bombardment, leaving gaping craters where lush parks and cultural landmarks once stood. The skyline was unrecognizable, with towers that had been toppled or set up lies. "We'll land near the city's east district," Rook said, pointing to a highlighted spot on the map. "It's still standing, and there are survivors in that area." "Lyra, open a comm channel to the Resistance." Lyra tapped a few commands on her console. "Channel open. They're expecting us." The voice that crackled over the comms was gruff and panicked, but Rook could hear the desperation in it. "Captain, you've got to hurry. We've lost contact with most of the outer sectors. The Colgarians are closing in. They've got their ships in orbit and ground troops scattered all over the city. There's no telling how much longer we can hold on." "Hang tight," Rook replied, his voice firm. "We're coming in hot. Get your people ready." As the Elysium flew lower, the ship's sensors picked up more Colgarian activity. Patrols of armored Colgarians marched through the streets, weapons at the ready. Their massive lizard-like forms moved with the precision of a military machine. They were methodical, checking buildings, searching for survivors, and systematically eliminating anyone who resisted. "Lyra, can we drop in closer?" Rook asked, scanning the terrain below. The streets were narrow and winding, making the Elysium's landing difficult. "Not without compromising the cloaking device," Lyra replied. "We'll need to land on the outskirts of the district, outside the main path of the patrols." Rook nodded. "Do it. We'll make our way on foot from there. Eric, you're with me. Everyone else stays in position." As the ship came to a gentle landing in a deserted square, the Elysium's cloak disengaged, and the shimmering effect faded. The crew quickly disembarked, their boots making soft thuds against the cracked pavement. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of burning buildings and scorched earth reaching them even inside their suits. "Stay low," Rook instructed, his voice low but authoritative. "We've got civilians to save and Colgarians to avoid." They moved through the quiet streets, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of enemy activity. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the ruins of the city, a constant reminder of the violence that had overtaken the once thriving metropolis. As they rounded a corner, Rook's sharp eyes caught sight of a group of survivors, humans and Drosians alike, huddled in the shadow of a collapsed building. They were dirty, scared, and exhausted, but alive. For now, that was all that mattered. Rook stepped forward, his hand raised in a peaceful gesture. "We're here to help," he said, his voice soft yet commanding. "We're getting you out of here." The survivors looked up, some with hope, others with disbelief. One elderly Drosian, a frail woman with silver hair, stepped forward. You came," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're our last hope." Rook nodded, his expression firm but sympathetic. "You're not alone. We'll get you out of here, but we need to move fast." As they gathered the survivors, Rook could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. This wasn't just a mission. It was a fight for the future of Drozia, and possibly for the lives of countless other worlds who would one day find themselves in the same position. Drozia in flames. The moment the Elysium touched down on Drozia's scarred surface, the world outside the ship was nothing like the serene paradise it had once been. Rook stepped out onto the cracked streets, his boots sinking into the charred earth beneath him. The once vibrant green skyline of Lethra was now a maze of twisted metal and broken buildings. The plumes of black smoke that rose into the sky were a silent testament to the destruction the Colgarians had brought with them. A thin, acrid haze hung in the air, the stench of burnt wood and metal mingling with the metallic scent of blood. The city of Lethra had been a hub of Drosian culture, its glass towers gleaming with natural light that reflected off the lush forests that surrounded it. Now, all that was left was a shadow of what it once was, and the flames that devoured the city seemed to mock the tranquility it had known. Rook could hear the distant sound of explosions and the sharp crackle of energy blasts. The Colgarians were relentless, tearing apart the city block by block, their brutal campaign of destruction unyielding. He glanced around, noting the way the streets were eerily quiet, except for the occasional flicker of movement in the distance. "We need to move fast," Rook said, his voice low but steady. "The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that the Colgarians will catch on to our presence. Lyra, how much longer do we have before their patrols get any closer?" Lyra's voice crackled through the comms. "I'm tracking their movements from here. The nearest patrol is about 3 blocks away, heading towards your position. You'll need to make it to the Resistance hideout quickly, or they'll have you surrounded." Rook cursed under his breath. The city was a labyrinth of twisted streets, and though the Elysium was cloaked, their stealth would only last so long once they set foot on the ground. "Understood. Eric, you're with me. We'll clear a path. Lyra, stay on comms and keep an eye on the Colgarian movements. We need to get these people to safety." Eric grinned, his massive frame already moving toward the entrance of the ship. "I'm always ready," he said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. As the rest of the crew prepared to escort the survivors, Rook scanned the area again, searching for any signs of danger. His hand tightened around the hilt of his pulse rifle. They had no time to waste. The survivors, a ragtag group of Drosians and humans, moved quickly but cautiously behind Rook and Eric. They were a mix of old and young, their faces gaunt and drawn from hunger and fear. Many of them had lost their homes, their families, everything. Rook could see the strain in their eyes, the hopelessness, but there was a flicker of something else there too. Determination. They were survivors. As they moved down the narrow streets, Rook's thoughts lingered on the message they had received from the Resistance. It was a cry for help, yes, but it was also a desperate plea for something more, something that felt like a last chance. If they couldn't make it through this, if they couldn't fight back, Drozia would fall, and the Colgarians would spread across the sector like a plague, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. "Stay close," Rook instructed. "Don't make a sound unless I say so. If the Colgarians are anywhere nearby, we'll need to be quick." They made their way through the ruined city, ducking into alleyways and moving through the wreckage of collapsed buildings. Every step felt like an eternity. The tension was palpable in the air, and Rook could sense the Colgarians closing in with every passing moment. He could hear their voices in the distance, barking orders in their guttural language, their footsteps echoing on the shattered streets. The sound made his skin crawl, but they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. Suddenly, a burst of movement caught Rook's eye. A Colgarian patrol, 4 of them, heavily armed, rounded the corner ahead. Their alien forms, tall and reptilian, were easily recognizable, their armored exoskeletons gleaming in the dim light. The Colgarians were vicious, calculating, and merciless. They had no qualms about slaughtering anyone in their path. "Take cover," Rook hissed, his voice barely a whisper. The survivors ducked behind the nearest building, trying to blend into the shadows. Rook and Eric followed suit, pressing themselves against the cold, burnt walls of a nearby structure. Rook's heart raced as he crouched low, his eyes locked on the Colgarian patrol. The Colgarians moved with military precision, their heads swiveling as they scanned the area. They were hunting, and Rook knew that if they were caught, the mission would be a failure, and the survivors would be as good as dead. "Lyra, do you have a visual on them?" Rook whispered into his comm. Lyra's voice came through, calm and measured. "I see them. They're close to your position. If you can take them out quietly, I'll trigger a distraction from the Elysium to cover your retreat." Rook turned to Eric, who was already reaching for his weapons. "We take them out quietly," Rook said. "We can't afford any noise." Eric nodded, his massive hands adjusting the grip on his plasma blade. His eyes glinted with excitement. This was the kind of thing he lived for. With the stealth of a predator, Rook and Eric moved out from their cover, their footsteps light and careful. They crept up behind the first Colgarian, Rook's hand raised in a signal to Eric. In one swift motion, Eric lunged forward, using his sheer strength to incapacitate the Colgarian before it could even react. Rook's pulse rifle was next, taking down another Colgarian with a quick shot to the chest. The remaining two Colgarians reacted with a fury, but Rook was already upon them, his combat training taking over. With a swift kick, he disarmed the third Colgarian, sending its weapon skittering across the ground. Eric followed up, knocking the final Colgarian unconscious with a single strike. "Clear," Rook muttered, his breath coming in short bursts. They quickly stripped the Colgarians of their weapons, taking anything that could be useful. The survivors emerged from their hiding places, eyes wide with shock and relief. They had witnessed the brutality of the Colgarians firsthand, but they were starting to see the first glimmers of hope. "Good work," Rook said, his voice low. "Let's move before they realize something's wrong." As they continued through the ruins of the city, Rook couldn't help but think of the battle still ahead. The Resistance had requested their help, but the true challenge lay in fighting the Colgarians without getting bogged down in a battle they couldn't win. They needed a plan, and fast. The city of Lethra was no longer a place of peace. It was a battlefield, and Rook could feel the weight of that truth in every step he took. But in his heart, there was something else, a fire, a determination to push forward. This was a fight for the soul of Drozhia, and they wouldn't give up until the last breath was drawn.